Hello, everyone. Welcome to another Mysterious Galaxy virtual event. Sorry about the technical difficulties. Sometimes internet shenanigans happen. I'm Nick with Mysterious Galaxy, and tonight we have J.A. Jance for the latest in the J.P. Beaumont series, Nothing to Lose, and a wonderful cover it looks like. This is the 25th in the series, and everyone that orders the book with Mysterious Galaxy will get a signed book plate from Ms. J.A. Jance herself. If you haven't already ordered, you can definitely do that now if you want. Click the link below. If you have any questions you want to ask, you can also click the link below that says Ask a Question. I'm going to pop on later to help with answering questions, and I'll see you all later.
Okay, here's the deal, folks. Everything he said was repeated, so I didn't understand any of it. And if any of you are hearing me in double time, then we need to let the moderator know so we can take another crack at fixing this. But hello, I'm J.A. Jance, and it's hard to be at ease and happy-go-lucky when you've just been through 10 minutes of technical hell. So I'll try to put on a happy face and tell you a little about me and a little about Nothing to Lose. I grew up in Bisbee, Arizona. I was one of 7 kids. 3 of us were born in South Dakota, 4 of us were born in Arizona, and as my mother said, I was the youngest one of the first batch. I was 4 years younger than my next older sister and 4 years older than my next younger brother. And that meant I was too young to play with the older kids and too old to play with the younger kids. And that's actually why I'm a writer today, because I turned into an observer rather than a participant. And that's what writers need to be. We need to be observers. We need to watch the people around us, and that's where we get stories, and that's where we get ideas, and that's how we see watching people interact provides us with material we can put in our books. So actually, in terms of my profession, my birth order was incredibly important. I grew up, I won a scholarship to the University of Arizona because I wanted to be a writer and had wanted to be a writer from 2nd grade on. I signed up to be an English major. And then, when I was a junior, I was working in the English department 15 hours a week, and my job was putting the faculty mail in the mailboxes. And the creative writing professor came in, and I turned to him and I said, "Oh, I'm hoping to sign up for your class this semester." And he looked at me and he said, "You're a girl." And I said, "So?" He said, "Girls become teachers or nurses. Boys become writers." And he wouldn't let me into his class. So I married a guy who was allowed in the class that was closed to him. He passed the class, never published anything. The class that was closed to me, he got into the program that was closed to me. And shortly after we married, in 1968, we married in 67, in 68, he told me, "There's only going to be one writer in our family, and I'm it." And so, while I was married to him, I put my writing aside. He was a troubled man. He was a drinker. And we were teaching on the reservation. We'd come home from school, we had dinner, and by 6:30, 7 o'clock, he'd be passed out cold in his chair. And we lived 30 miles from town 2 miles off the highway, and 7 miles to the nearest neighbor and or telephone. So on those long nights by myself, I would sit at the dining room table and jot off pieces of poetry. At the time I was writing them, I thought I was being true to my art. I knew I wasn't being true to him because I wasn't supposed to be writing. So I hid the poetry away in the strongbox, a place I knew he would never go to look. And he never saw any of it. In 1980, between 1972 and 1980, he was hospitalized 9 times for chronic alcoholism. And in April of 1980, after my 6-year-old son's t-ball game, my husband was so drunk at 5 o'clock in the afternoon that he crawled on his hands and knees from the bleachers to the car. And it was during that walk with my kids' friends, my kids' friends' parents, when I finally realized that if 18 years of loving him hadn't fixed him, I had to do something to save my children and save myself. So, they just sent me a note saying they can hear me. That's a good thing. If I've been doing double talk all this time, it would be incredibly frustrating. So I got a divorce in 1980, not because I stopped loving him, but because I knew if he asked me to take, I did it. I got the divorce to save myself. And then I had to leave Phoenix because I knew if he asked me to take him back, I would. So I came to Seattle. And after I arrived in Seattle, I gave myself permission to start living my dream. I did the Dale Carnegie course. I was selling life insurance at the time. And my company offered to pay for the Dale Carnegie course. And so I thought it was, of course, in winning friends and influencing people. When I got there and found out it was, of course, in public speaking, I didn't really want to take it. But that was the only way to get my $700 back, was to take the whole thing. So I did. And in the course of, in Dale Carnegie, every participant gives talks on various topics. And one of the topics was supposed to be something that changed the course of your life. And I was thinking, well, whatever happened to me? And then I remembered back in 1970 how on the 22nd of May, my first husband and I crossed paths with a serial killer. I was still at school. My husband hitchhiked home with a guy who, half an hour before, had forced a woman off the highway at gunpoint, shot her, raped her in front of her 2 small children, and left her to die. We found out about it later when we were going into town for dinner. We got stopped at a roadblock. And when we stopped at the trading post to get gas, my husband was pumping the gas. I went in to pay the bill. And I overheard the deputy talking about a man in a green car and 2 little kids. And when I got back into the car, I reported that conversation to my husband. And he said, boy, I wonder if that's the guy who gave me a ride home. A man in a green car. I wonder if that's the guy who gave me a ride home today. So we went back to the trading post. We told the deputy who we were and where we lived and that we didn't have a phone. And at 6 o'clock the next morning, Jack Lyons, who was Pima County's chief homicide investigator, was at our house. He interviewed my husband from 6 o'clock in the morning until 3-4 o'clock in the afternoon. And he arrived so early I didn't have my contacts in. So I listened to that entire interview with my whole being, evidently, because years later, I could recall that whole conversation almost verbatim. The information my husband provided was used by the detectives in identifying who the killer was. The He did a composite drawing of the guy who gave him a road of the ride home, and as soon as he did that, the little 4-year-old boy looked at the composite and said, "That's the man who killed my mommy." That was on the 22nd of May. Within days, Jack Lyons had identified the killer, but he had also come to understand that he was dealing with a serial killer, someone who killed people at 20 minutes after 2 on the 22nd day of the month. And he shot them off moving vehicles. He shot a 16-year-old girl off a bicycle, a 40-something-year-old man off a bulldozer, and the woman who was driving to Rocky Point with her kids. Jack didn't exactly tell us that. He advised us to move. We were young and stupid. We said, well, we're not going to move. We're going to stay here. But my husband worked out of town. He worked construction during the summers. So I spent 40 of the next 60 days on the hill by myself. And I wore a loaded weapon. I was fully prepared to use it. In fact, I did use it one morning. I shot all 6 shots at a rapidly retreating rattlesnake who was still laughing when it went over the wall and disappeared. But I figured if the killer showed up, he would present a larger target, and I was motivated. Now, that's talk about a moment that something that changed your life. When I made that decision, that critical decision, that if it came down to him or me, it was going to be him. It's like I toggled a switch in my soul, and you can't unring that bell. And I think that's part of what makes it possible for me to write police procedurals, because I recognize that those kinds of life and death decisions are things police officers out on the street have to decide on every single day. Now, the person who is barking right now is our dachshund named Jojo. She is a small dog. When we bought this house, it had a doggy door for big dogs. Jojo's legs are only this long. So her idea of a doggy door is she goes to it and she barks until I come and open it and let her out. She can do it. And so I'm just going to ignore her and see if she doesn't go away. Jack Lyons was investigating this case. He realized that the incidents were getting closer together. The 22nd of July was coming, and he wanted the guy in custody before the 22nd of July. So on the 20th of July, he took my husband up to San Manuel. My husband identified the killer as he came off work, put him in the back of the Jack Lyons' vehicle, and drove back to Tucson. And it was on that drive that the killer admitted that he had been to our house on 3 separate occasions in the intervening 60 days. So I gave a talk about that. And after the talk, one of my classmates came up and said, somebody should write a book about that. And I thought, well, I'm divorced. What have I got to lose? And so I thought about it. That was Thursday night. I thought about it on Friday. I thought about it on Saturday. And Sunday morning, about 1, 2 o'clock in the morning, I realized that somebody doesn't want to read a book where you have this life-changing experience and 10 years later you get a divorce. So I decided that I was going to write a novel. I was going to take that story and fictionalize it. And Sunday afternoon, middle of March of 1982, that's exactly what I did. I sat down and I started writing. I was a single mom. I had 2 little kids. I had a full-time job selling life insurance. The only time I had to write was from 4 o'clock in the morning until 7 o'clock in the morning before I got my kids up to go to school and got me dressed to go sell life insurance. And on weekends, my sister took the kids to bargain matinees on weekends. But working those hours between the middle of March and the 22nd of May, I wrote a 1,400-page rough draft. Now, the good thing about writing 1,400 pages is it's way too big to be published. 1,400 pages is the equivalent of 3 complete novels. And when I took it to an agent, she said, "Oh, you need to cut it in half." So I did. And then she tried to sell it. Nobody wanted to buy it. They said that the stuff that was fiction was fine, and the stuff that was real was unbelievable and would never happen, even though it had already happened. And so while that book was out on the turn down trail, my agent suggested that I write something that was entirely fiction. Now, the thing about writing that book that has never been published and never will be is that was my on-the-job training. In writing that book, I learned how to do dialogue, I learned how to do place setting, I learned how to do plotting and pacing, all those tools that you have to have at your disposal in order to be a writer. So my agent suggested that I write something else. So in the fall of 1982, I decided that I was going to write a detective novel set in Seattle. So I decided he was going to be a Seattle homicide cop. So I gave this character a job. I gave him a name, J.P. Beaumont. And actually, J.P. Beaumont is named after a friend of mine. During those tough years in Phoenix, when my life was just spiraling out of control, I had a friend named Estelle Dubose, who was born and raised, in Beaumont, Texas. And Estelle, now she's barking because the dogs are barking outside. Now she really will go through the door sometime soon. Estelle was this wonderful friend, and I could go to her with my heart broken, and she would counsel me. So one day I went to see Estelle, and she said, "Well, Judy, what's the matter?" And I said, things are so bad right now that I can't eat, I can't sleep, I can't even pray about it. And she said, "Well, I'll tell you what. You pray to get through whatever you have to do each day. You pray for the little stuff, and I will pray for the big stuff. I will pray to see you in your perfect place." And I have to say, Estelle Dubose from Beaumont, Texas, did a wonderful job of praying, because here I am, all these years later, living in my perfect place and doing the job I always dreamed of doing. I'm sorry about Jojo. I can't fix it. I could fix it, but I'm not going to fix it because, people think writers have totally placid lives and that nothing impinges on their ability to create. Well, guess what? Dachshunds can certainly impinge. They're incredibly bossy little dogs. So I gave that character the name of Beaumont after my friend Estelle's hometown. Okay, I'm going to give up. I'm going to go see if I can let her out. You're going to have to excuse me. Just pretend that I'm taking a pee break. Oh, hold on. Okay, so I'm sorry, but this is my life. This is my real life. So I gave him a name, I gave him a job, I gave him a place to live in the fall of 1982. And then I waited to see what was going to happen. And guess what? For 6 months, nothing happened. He just, I had this story sort of bubbling around in my head, but it wouldn't come together. So finally it was March. Now I've frozen. Now I have frozen up. It says I'm live. Yes, but I'm frozen. Can anybody else? Am I moving for anybody else? I'm not moving for me. Okay, can you see me and hear me? Tell me if you can't see me and hear me, have Nick come back on and restart this program. Anyway, when when spring came around that year, the event is currently something. I wish I could tell if it's still on. Can can somebody say, am I talking? Question mark. Okay, it's sort of weird to see myself staring up at the ceiling and dead still, but if you can still hear me, I'll try to keep on talking and we'll just ignore that frozen image. When spring break came around that year, I sent my kids to Camp Orkala for spring break. And then I put myself on the train to go from Seattle to Portland to spend some time with a friend of mine from my days in the insurance business. I got on the train with a stack of blue line notebooks and a fistful of ballpoint pens. And as the train pulled out of the King Street station, I thought, what would happen if I wrote this book through the detective's point of view? So I got out a notebook, I got out a pen, and I started to write. And I wrote the words, she might have been a cute kid once. That was hard to tell now. She was dead. And as soon as I wrote those words, a miracle happened. Because all of a sudden, I was on the backside of Magnolia Bluff in Seattle. I was walking around a crime scene with J.P. Beaumont's in J.P. Beaumont's shoes. I was seeing it through his eyes. I was hearing what people said to him. I was hearing what he said to other people, but I was also hearing what was going on in his head. And J.P. Beaumont and I have been together as character and author from the fall of 1982 until now. So this is our 40th anniversary, longer than I've been married to my second husband, the good one. And this is Beaumont number 25. When I sat down to write that first Beaumont book, I really thought I was writing a standalone book. It didn't occur to me that I was writing, that I was going to end up writing 25 books about the same character. And, you know, nobody, I don't know which of us is more surprised about that, J.P. Beaumont or me, that we're in for 25 books now. But we are, and nothing to lose is it. People ask me, well, where do you get your ideas? That's a strange question because it seems simple. An idea isn't something that just sort of flutters around in the air like a butterfly and you catch it with a net. It has to be something that really touches you. And if I put characters in one book, or if I write a book, the only way to find out what happens to those characters later on is to write another book. In this book, we are dealing with part of J.P. Beaumont's history. He has a history. I met him in the early 80s when he was a middle-aged homicide cop with a serious drinking problem. Oh, do you think I maybe got that serious drinking problem from my husband? Well, it turns out, yes, I did. But it also turns out I didn't notice. If I had taken that creative writing class, I'm sure they would have told me, you need to write what you know. I didn't take the class, but I was sort of smart enough to figure that out on my own. And so Beau's stories are told in the first person. He was at work a lot of the time, but he couldn't work all the time. And he needed something to do when he wasn't at work. So I had him drink. I just happened to know a lot about drinking. And when I decided to do that, it was just sort of stage business. I didn't apply any particular importance to it. But I wrote 4 books in a row. I wrote Until Proven Guilty when Avon Books bought that as the first book in a series. Then I was surprised because I had to write another book and another book and another book. When the 4th book came out, I was down in Portland doing that was wrong. I was down in Portland doing a signing. And a lady came up to the table and she said, you know, Beau drinks every day. He has a drink of choice and it's starting to interfere with his work. Does J.P. Beaumont have a problem? And I said, these are books. But in the course of that set of signings, 6 other people asked me the same question. And that's when I realized they were right. He did have a problem because I'm trying to turn the video back on and it's not working. The video is back on. It's back on for me. It has been awful trying to talk, staring at me in frozen space. The reason Beaumont's drinking came through so realistically is I was writing about the kind of drinking done by problem drinkers. And so it's been really gratifying to me over the years to have people write to me and tell me how much reading about Beau's struggle with drinking has has you know, helped them deal with their own drinking. So Beaumont and I have been together at the same time for a long time, and uh, Nothing to Lose harkens back to something that happened in Beau's life in Beaumont number 14, a book called Breach of Duty. At that point in the series and in Beau's and my arc together, he was working homicide at Seattle PD, and his partner was Sue Danielson. Sue was a single mom, divorced from an abusive ex-husband, raising two sons, Jared and Christopher, on her own. She worked her way up from being a 911 operator to working homicide. So there's a learning curve while Beau is learning that it's okay to have a female partner at homicide. And then Sue's ex-husband reappears on the scene, and he is not a good guy. And when Sue draws the line and says, no, you can't do what you wanted to do, he comes after her. Well, by this time, J.P. Beaumont knew Sue Danielson's kids, and they knew him. So when this terrible fight breaks out between his parents in the other room, Jared Danielson picks up the phone and calls Beau. And Beau says, Jared, take Christopher, go out through the window, go up the street 2 blocks, wait there by the troll under the bridge, and somebody will come and get you. Because Beau thinks that having one cop car show up in the course of this domestic violence incident will be better than having a whole flock of patrol cars show up at the same time. That's Lone Rangering it. That was a bad idea. But that's the call he made. And when he finally gets to the house and goes in, it's too late because Sue Danielson is lying against the living room wall, shot, bleeding out. But at least the kids are safe. That was a watershed moment in J.P. Beaumont's life. Sue Danielson's death was the reason he left Seattle Homicide and went off on another path. He worked for the Attorney General for a number of years. And now, as Nothing to Lose starts, he is living in Bellingham, where his wife, Mel Soames, is chief of police in Bellingham. He is retired. He's trying to be a good house husband. He's not exactly good at any of those things. But it's almost Christmas, so he dutifully gets his rear in gear and starts putting up Christmas decorations. But he's looking after their new dog. They rescued a mommy puppy mill dog, an Irish wolfhound named Sarah. And so he's looking after Sarah, and there's a knock on the door. So he goes to the door, and here's this young man in priestly attire standing there. And see, all these years later, I still know what's going on in Beau's head, whether he says it or not. And so he sees this young priest standing outside, and he's thinking, boy, has the Catholic Church sunk so low that they have to go out door to door these days? And then the young man introduces himself. And his name is Father Jared Danielson, Sue Danielson's oldest son. It turns out that his brother Chris, his younger brother Chris, has gone missing in Alaska. And Jared is there to ask Bo if he will help locate his brother. So naturally, this is not a job J.P. Beaumont can turn down. So there is nothing for him to do but to head out to Alaska. Someone said, well, why did you set this book in Alaska? Do you have a connection to Alaska? What is it? I've been to Alaska 5 times, 4 of them on cruises. And that's my only connection to Alaska. But the problem is, in Breach of Duty, that's where that family was from. That's where Sue Danielson's husband's family was from, Alaska. So since I have to sort of go by the history of my characters in the books, Alaska is where Chris disappeared. One of the things I set out to do when I started writing was to let Bo age. I could never have been Sue Grafton and have written all those books in a row about one character, and I couldn't be John D. MacDonald and have Travis McGee sort of march in place without getting any older or any wiser either, for that matter. So Bo is older, and he likes to think of himself as still being young and tough. But the truth is he's not. And when he's faced with wintertime weather in Alaska, he's out of his league. And luckily for all of us, when Mel says, get a driver, he listens to his wife and he gets a driver. And my favorite character in the book turns up, and her name is Twinkle Winkleman, Twink. As soon as I met her, as soon as I wrote her word into the name into the manuscript, Twinkle Winkleman made me laugh out loud. I write murder mysteries. I watch true crime a lot. Bill calls what I watch blood and guts TV. He likes home and garden TV. He's a gearhead, so he likes Motor Trend. And for years on Motor Trend, there was a show called Wheeler Dealers, and it was these 2 Brits. One would go out and buy some iconic car or other and bring it home, and the mechanic guy, the handsome one as far as I'm concerned, would take the pieces apart and put it back together and paint it up and make it all shiny and new, and then they would sell it. And during their last season, one of the vehicles they rehabbed was an International Harvester travel all. I knew International Harvester made tractors, but I had no idea that they manufactured a vehicle, an automobile, that was the precursor to every lumbering SUV you see on the road, because that's what the travel all was. It was this big brute of a car. And it was long before Suburbans, it was long before Explorers, but those vehicles came as a result of the travel-all. So I loved that show, and I watched them rebuild it and repaint it and get rid of all the interior carpeting. And eventually they put this big luggage rack on the top. And Twink's vehicle, the travel-all for TW Transportation in Anchorage, is modeled after the vehicle in that episode of Wheeler Dealer. Sometimes characters will do what you want them to do and what you expect them to do. And when I met Twink, I thought she was going to show up in Anchorage and drive him around Anchorage, and that would be the end of it. But then she ended up driving him to Homer, and I thought she'd drop him off in Homer, and that would be the end of it. Well, how wrong could I be? Because Twink is still there playing a vital role in the crashing climax of this book. I think one of the things this book does is it shows what happens as a result of homicides that occur due to domestic violence, because there's a death, but there is this huge fracture in families, and those broken parts are never repaired. In this book, we have feuding grandparents who don't communicate with each other, and because the grandparents don't communicate, nobody knows that Chris is actually missing. The grandparents in Alaska think he's with the grandparents in Ohio, and the ones in Ohio think he's in Alaska, and nobody pays attention to the fact that he's gone. I was on the Tohono O'odham Reservation west of Tucson for 5 years as a K through 12 librarian. And I told 26 stories a week in K through 6 classrooms. And some of them were the stories we all grew up with. The little engine that could make way for ducklings, Rapunzel, Cinderella, all of those wonderful fairy tales. The kids on the reservation loved those stories, but they also loved the stories of the Tohono O'odham people, and I learned to tell those too. By the way, the Toy stories of the Tohono O'odham are winter telling tales. You're only allowed to tell those stories between the middle of November and the middle of March. Because if you tell a story, one of those stories, when the snakes and lizards are out, if a snake or lizard overhears the story, they can swallow the storyteller's luck and bring them harm. So I found that out when I told an Toy story in April. The parent turned me into the principal, and Sister Marie Bernadette Dorn put me straight, and I have followed that rule ever since. So in addition, and it makes sense that you would tell stories in the winter. The winter is when you're gathered around the fire, sort of huddled together, hungry but trying to keep warm. And that's the time you need stories. Not when you're supposed to be out hunting and gathering and planting and working in the spring and summer, but in the winter, stories are what bind us together. And I've been so gratified in the past 2 years to hear from people who are reading my books for the first time, or maybe rereading them for the second or third time during this time of isolation and COVID, because I think in these dark times, we really do need stories to keep us moving. But one of the hallmarks of Tohono O'odham storytelling is that a story must end where it begins. And in Nothing to Lose, the story begins with Beaumont dealing with that Sue Danielson nightmare. He has had recurring nightmares about that awful event. ever since it happened. For 20 years now, it's been eating away at his soul. And I can tell you that Nothing to Lose starts with that nightmare, and Nothing to Lose ends with that nightmare. Because I think the Tohono O'odham are right, and stories do need to end where they begin. I really have, I'm sorry. The
I'm sorry, what,
technical end
Judy?
of this. I said, I'm so sorry the technical end of this has been difficult, but we've done the best we could.
Do you still hear me as an echo?
I am still hearing you double time. If you want to send me a message, type it into the thing and I'll read it. But I can't understand what you're saying. Do I find it more challenging to write a first book in a series than the later books in the series? Writing a book is challenging. You have to start it. You have to work your way, slog your way through the middle, and then get to the end. I think writing every book is challenging. And I don't think if you start a series, I didn't know I was starting a series when I started Beaumont. And if I had known I was starting a series, I probably was frozen solid and able to write a word. But since then, I have been able to figure out where to start and where to end. By the way, I don't outline. I'm outlining in Mrs. Watkins' sixth grade geography class at Greenway School in Bisbee, Arizona. And I hated outlining then. I hate outlining now. Nothing that has happened to me in the intervening decades has changed my mind about outlining. So because I write murder mysteries, I usually start with somebody dead or dying. And then I spend the rest of the book trying to figure out who did it and how come. Why did Jean Angenie stop reading the J.P. Beaumont books? J.P. Beaumont, Jean Angenie began reading my books in the late 80s when he was already retired from being a drama professor at Eastern Washington University. And he was hired by a little company called Books in Motion. And their niche, they recorded books, and their niche audience was long haul truck drivers. A truck driver could rent the book at a truck stop on one side of the country and drop it off at a truck stop on the other side of the country. And so whenever there was a snowstorm, I would get fan mail on Motel 6 stationery from all over the country. But that was in the late 80s, and he was already retired, and he stopped because he retired again. But as soon as I heard him read the first words in Until Proven Guilty, I was hooked. And I've listened to the other readers, but I've never heard a narrator who captures Beau the way Jean Angenie did. Who inspired the character Allie Reynolds? I wrote 9 Beaumont books. I was tired of Beau. I threatened to knock him off, and my editor said, "Oh no, don't do that. Why don't you write something else? Do you remember that first book nobody ever bought? Why don't you rework that one, and we'll have that be your first hardback?" Well, I didn't want to write that real story from back in the 70s, but I took what I learned watching that investigation unfold, and I took what I learned by being on the reservation for all those years, and I created Hour of the Hunter, the first Walker family book. By the way, it was also my first experience with writerly revenge. The main character in the main protagonist in that book, Diana Ladd, is a woman who always wanted to be a writer, but she's a teacher on the Indian reservation. Like me, she had a husband who was allowed in the creative writing program that was closed to her. He's dead at the beginning of the book, and the crazed killer turns out to be a former professor of creative writing from the University of Arizona. That was fun to write. Well, when I went back to write about Bo, it was fun. So my editor said, well, why don't you come up with another character that you can alternate with Bo? And that's when I invented Joanna Brady. But then around 2000, I was tired of all of those guys. I was just done with them. And my editor said, okay, write something new character, old character, set it wherever you like. And have it here by the 1st of January, and we will publish it as an original paperback. Well, it was May. Write a book between May and January. That's no big deal. And so I signed a contract. They gave me a deadline. They gave me a paycheck. And then time passed. May and June passed. July and August passed. September. Suddenly it was the middle of October. And I still had no idea who was going to be in the book that was supposed to be in January, in New York in January. So when I have writer's block, that's writer's block, by the way. And when I have writer's block, I compulsively watch the news. We were in Tucson, so on this Thursday, I went in and watched the noon news, and my favorite newscaster, Patty Weiss, was on the air. 5 o'clock in the afternoon came around. I still had writer's block. So I went back in to watch the 5 o'clock news, and Patty Weiss was totally among the missing. They didn't say she was on assignment. They didn't say anything. She was just gone. Well, over the following weekend, we learned that between the noon news and the 5 o'clock news, the station's new news manager had told her she was too old to be on TV and escorted her out of the building. Well, it's a bad idea to make mystery writers mad. And so within days, I was writing about a character named Allie Reynolds being let go from her news anchor job in LA for the same reason. And that's where Allie Reynolds came from. Hello, are we still there? One last question. Is there anything I'm working on right now? Yes, I am down to the last couple of chapters of a book called Collateral Damage. It's the next Allie Reynolds book. That book has been very difficult for me to write. The ending has kept eluding me. But, and so the pub date has been moved, and I'm hearing from people who say, well, it says it won't be released until 2045. Well, I don't think I'll still be around in 2045 either. 2045 is a long way from here. So I don't know what the pub date will be, but if you want to find out about when books are coming out, and if you want to know more about who I am and what I do, go to my website, jajance.com, and I have a weekly blog that publishes every Friday. This morning it was about an episode from my mother that has my fans all over the country laughing today. It's my mother, the tale of my mother and her hammer toe. But I also wrote a blog about this publication date snafu, and it's called Pete Pearson's Eyebrows. So there you are.
Thank you, Judy. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in. So sorry about technical difficulties. Sometimes it happens. Please go ahead and buy if you haven't already. this book. Thank you, Judy.
Thank you. I'm frozen again, so I'm going to hang up. And
Okay.
I know some people love Crowdcast, but it's just Crowdcast, but it's not me. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye. Bye, everyone.